Think we're going to get started. Well, I'll give it just actually a couple minutes, so we'll start at 10:02.
We'll get started shortly. Just so you know, this session is being recorded.
All right, good morning. It seems like the flurry of activity has stopped and we have critical mass, so we will get started. My name is Lila McKinley. I am the Cannabis Control Division Director, and this is a presentation on remote pharmacy for hybrid retailers and dispensary facilities. So I want to just thank everybody for attending and for taking the time to sit with us and view our presentation and learn a little bit more about the department's policies on remote pharmacy and telehealth. And then I would just also like to thank everybody for their feedback. I know we had put out a couple drafts, we've requested your feedback, and a lot of folks did provide some feedback, and we addressed some of it in the newest version, which we had sent out, I believe, on Friday. So we're going to get started. I'm just going to start with basically talking about remote pharmacy work. So as most of you know, Public Act was recently passed that allows for reduced hours and reduced in-person pharmacists and essentially allows for remote pharmacy work. So what that means is telehealth consultations with qualifying patients and caregivers, as well as remote dispensing. I just want to pause here to discuss a little bit more about that feedback that was provided. We did receive, some feedback about just generally some criticism. Don't want to say criticism, but some distress about the statutory provision that was enacted. There was some feedback about the hour requirement. We as the department can only do what's in the statute. So we would encourage you, if you have questions about the hours and are unhappy with the hour requirement for in-person work for pharmacists, that you reach out to the legislature because that hour requirement was put in statute. The other thing I would just flag is that some folks also had some concerns about actually having a pharmacist on duty doing remote pharmacy work. They felt that the pharmacist shouldn't have to be doing like the remote dispensing. Again, that was something that was put forth in statute. There still is a requirement that a pharmacist dispense, however, they can do so remotely. And so again, that's something, if you have issues and concerns with a pharmacist actually having to do the dispensing, you would want to talk to the legislature about that. So we'll get started with the slideshow. So essentially, as I said, hybrid retailers and dispensary facilities now have the option to use remote pharmacists instead of being on site exclusively in person. Um, that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that they're never in person. If you had an opportunity to look at the statutory provision, you would also see that still a remote pharmacist must still work in person for 8 consecutive hours per calendar week. Um, and I just also want to flag that remote pharmacy is a new option, but it's not required. So this is a business decision for each cannabis establishment. It's something that you can do that's allowed by the law that was recently passed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it if it's not the best decision for you. So I want to talk a bit about how this works with pharmacists in multiple locations. This was the question that we received in our feedback, so I think it's important that we talk through and go over it. So pharmacists can perform remote pharmacy work for multiple hybrid retailers or dispensary facilities at the same time. But there are some caveats there. They need to make sure that the pharmacist is still readily available to provide telehealth consultations for qualifying patients and caregivers, that they can still perform remote dispensing properly, and that they can keep the 1-to-3 ratio of pharmacists to dispensary techs regardless of location, and make sure that that ratio is not exceeded. And then also make sure that the pharmacist is properly licensed with each location. So essentially, multiple locations. However, you need to be able to make that work for you within your business model to ensure that you have your pharmacist readily available to provide those telehealth consultations, that they can still do the remote dispensing efficiently and correctly, and that you keep the ratio intact. And what that means is essentially each pharmacist should have 3 dispensary techs to supervise, regardless of where they're located. So breaking this down, as I said, the new bill allows you to essentially do both telehealth consultations and remote dispensing. So we're going to talk a little bit first about telehealth consultations and what that looks like using a pharmacist remotely. So essentially, there's still some requirements that you have to abide by. Your pharmacist has to be licensed in Connecticut. They have to maintain a marijuana dispensary license, and they have to be registered at each hybrid retailer or dispensary facility. They must be registered as a key employee at that specific location. And they must work at each specific location a minimum of 20 hours per calendar week and a minimum of 8 consecutive hours per week in person. And that's irrespective of telehealth services that they're providing. So they need to be in person regardless of whether they're providing services via telehealth. Um, and the other thing, we've received this question, so I just want to flag this as well. Based on the legislation and the department's interpretation of the legislation, each hybrid retailer and dispensary facility is a separate and distinct license, and the hourly requirement is per location, or in other words, it's per license. So the way that the legislation is phrased is that this requirement for the hours for pharmacists is going to be per license. So each licensed facility has to maintain a pharmacist for 20 hours per calendar week, as well as have somebody in person 8 hours per week, and that would be at each licensed location. So if you are a facility, if you are a business that owns multiple locations, you need to make sure that each one of your licensed locations is meeting these requirements. So we'll talk a little bit about telehealth consultations. So what the statute required was that at all times, while hybrid retailers and dispensary facilities establishments are open to the public, they have to have a licensed pharmacist that's available for qualifying patients and caregivers, either in person or remotely. They also have to have a private space with adequate telehealth communication technology that's available for qualifying patients and caregiver consultations. And we'll get into a little bit more what the private space means, because there were some questions regarding this. A private consultation space is a place for pharmacists to meet in person or virtually with qualifying patients and caregivers, and it's required at each hybrid retailer or dispensary facility. Now, in terms of that space, just want to flag that there were some questions about whether or not it needs to be a separate room, whether or not it needs to have what it has to do to meet that privacy requirement. And again, you need to meet HIPAA requirements as a business. I think we gave an example in our guidance that a separate room would meet those requirements in terms of having a private space and meeting HIPAA requirements. However, if there's another way for you to provide a private space that meets the HIPAA requirements, then you may do so. But again, you need to ensure that it's a space that is private, that people can convey their medical information and feel comfortable and ensure that it's confidential. So, getting more into the location, again, telehealth services can be delivered from any location to a qualifying patient in another location, so long as the pharmacist is licensed in Connecticut and personal health information is protected. Um, the licensee is responsible for compliance with any applicable laws of another state if they are sitting in another state providing those telehealth consultations. And then just what's generally not acceptable, and this comes from the federal and state rules regarding HIPAA requirements and telehealth. Fax, texting, and email are typically not acceptable methods of telehealth consultations because they don't provide adequate protection of private health information. So really quickly, what is protected health information? So protected health information, often referred to PHI, it needs to be protected in remote pharmacy work, and you need to make sure to prevent disclosure in the same manner as you would during any sort of on-site care. So some examples I think that might come up, at least in remote pharmacy work, are medical records, facial photos, and cannabis allotments. Primarily, it's very important to protect public health information, and a lot of the technology requirements that we will go through will sort of highlight ways in which you can do that. This is required both in state and federal law. Generally, it's a HIPAA requirement and also a telehealth requirement for both state and federal law. So our technology requirements, as I said, they have to be HIPAA compliant. That's not anything that should be new to folks that are in the medical realm providing this type of care. Essentially, this is both a state and a federal requirement, as I said before. And then it also has to comply with our policies and procedure requirements when it comes to confidential information. That's 21A 421J 17. So essentially, in order to comply with that policy and procedure, the electronic system must be able to encrypt data to safeguard confidentiality. It has to comply with all state and federal laws for patient confidentiality. There should be limitations on the type of information and access to that information, including how long it's stored. So really only folks that need to access that information and only the type of information that you need to collect. The system should be capable of providing safeguards against erasures, unauthorized changes in data after the information has been entered, so protecting the integrity of the data. And then it must just be capable of being reconstructed in the event of a computer malfunction or data destruction. So I'll kind of go a little bit faster through some of these slides because they're pretty dense. I would encourage you to take a look at these slides on your own. But essentially, some of the technology considerations are things like encryption, firewall protection, antivirus software, backup for data, access controls to protected health information, things like two-factor authentication and PIN codes, and using strong passwords as well. And here's just some more technology considerations. Again, I'll kind of just highlight a few and you can take a look on your own. But these are some recommendations that the department and also our federal government has also put in place when it comes to telehealth. The platform should be patient friendly. Um, the telehealth visit should be held in private. Again, you want to minimize the risk that information is overheard. And you should take steps to verify that you're talking to the qualifying patient or talking to the right person when you're about to talk about some of their protected health information. This came up. You should avoid recording visits. It's certainly, I think there was some confusion in our feedback as to whether recording patient visits was required. It is absolutely not. You should definitely avoid doing so. If you must, then pursuant to state and federal rules, you need to obtain consent before you record. Um, and then the other thing is maybe just educating qualifying patients and caregivers on privacy. This will help them keep their information protected as well. So here are some examples of some acceptable telehealth software. So Zoom for healthcare, Skype, Teams with certain security add-ons, DoxyMeet, GoToMeeting, Google Meet. And these are not this is not like a robust list of the types of platforms you can use. You certainly can use others if they meet the requirements. And if you have another that you want the department to maybe take a look at and let you know if there might be compliance issues, we're happy to do that. You can send it to our DCP cannabis inbox. And essentially, there is also a great resource on the federal side. The HHS website has a list of some of the acceptable telehealth platforms as well that can be used and are considered HIPAA compliant. Some example of unacceptable telehealth software, pretty basic, but a lot of their live chats, Facebook Messenger, TikTok, you don't want to Facebook Live your consultations, Twitch, you don't want to have consultations in public chat forums, things like that would not be acceptable. And then just in terms of record keeping, so all telehealth records are subject to the same retention requirements as any other cannabis establishment records. It's policy procedure 21A 421J6. And as I said before, telehealth does not require the recording of patients. So getting into kind of the next arm of remote pharmacy, and this is remote dispensing and final verification. And again, the Public Act statute allowed now for remote dispensing. And so what does that look like? So essentially, right before you is the definition of dispense. So it's comparing label directions with certification instructions, selecting the appropriate cannabis from stock, affixing the label, providing instructions for use. The way that this will look remotely, the remote pharmacist will work with the on-site dispensary tech, communicating through audio and visual technology. And the remote pharmacist is ultimately responsible for remote final verification. So what does remote final verification mean? The pharmacist must visually inspect all orders, labels, and dispense cannabis products, including information, name, quantity, strength, patient profile, a picture of the label and the product itself, caregiver information, and certified instructions. And note that the final verification record should include the above information, as well as the name of the dispensary technician and the remote pharmacist that worked on the order. So how does this work with text? And what's the role of the dispensary technician? So any person that has an active pharmacy tech registration in Connecticut within the last 4 years can apply to the department to become a registered dispensary tech. And then essentially the tech is going to be doing a lot of those assisting in those dispensing functions. But at the end of the day, the pharmacist will do the final verification remotely. So what that means is the tech can do PDMP entry. They just have to be designated by the remote pharmacist and have the proper training. And you can find requirements about the training and designation in the statutes relating to the PDMP. On-site assistance to the remote pharmacist. So they're going to be providing assistance under that remote supervision with audio-visual communications. And then ultimately the pharmacist will provide that final verification and complete the entire dispensing process. Um, so what kind of technology do you need to engage in remote dispensing? So very similar to telehealth, it has to be HIPAA compliant and it has to comply with policy and procedure 21A 421J 17. Again, what that means is that you have to have an electronic system that can encrypt data, complies with all state and federal laws, limited access, and limited collection of data to what's only necessary, capable of providing safeguards against erasures and unauthorized changes, and again, capable of reconstruction in the event of a malfunction or data destruction. So examples of acceptable remote final verification software. So essentially, there are a lot of different ways in which you can meet this requirement. And so we do encourage you, if you have things that you haven't run by the department or are not necessarily typical, to please just submit your request DCP .cannabis DCP at CT, dcp.cannabis at ct.gov. And we will do some issue spotting for you in terms of compliance. We're not going to necessarily approve a system, but we will tell you where we might see some issues with respect to HIPAA compliance or other issues. So essentially, the system has to be encrypted. It should be password protected. It should be a web-based application. It should have store and forward technology for written records and visual images. And then it should also have some sort of audio feature that will allow the remote pharmacist to speak with on-site staff who are engaged in the dispensing. Some platforms that will likely meet these requirements are Zoom Workplace for healthcare, and then Skype or Teams with certain security add-ons that ensure that the protected health information is in fact protected. And essentially there may be others. You should definitely take a look at the HIPAA requirements and see if that can work for you. In terms of the store and forward technology, I think we had some questions about store and forward technology. I will point out that store and forward technology is very typical of any sort of telehealth system or system where you are collecting protected health information. And essentially what this does is allow you to store health data and forward it for review, which will often probably come up in this scenario because you will be forwarding pictures of product or forwarding labels or orders or the like. And so ensuring that you have the appropriate technology to do that will help you ensure that you are performing remote dispensing correctly. So what are some unacceptable examples of remote final verification software? Again, there's a lot of wiggle room here, a lot of kind of different options for you to try. However, there are some that it's pretty clear would not be an acceptable way to engage in remote final verification or remote dispensing. Calling the remote pharmacist on the telephone and asking for audio only final verification would not meet the requirements of final verification, or using some sort of unsecured technology that is going to expose protected health information such as Facebook Messenger or a personal cell phone to send an image. All of those would not be acceptable either because they wouldn't be acceptable for performing remote final verification, or they may result in public protected health data getting leaked in some sort of fashion. And then this last slide here is about record keeping requirements. And I do want to flag that we had a few questions about the record keeping requirements. So I will try to address those as we go through this slide. Essentially, patient records must be maintained in accordance with Section 21A 4083 of the Regulations of Connecticut State Agencies and Sections 21A 421J 6 and 7 of the Policies and Procedures. Say it one more time, telehealth does not require the recording of patients. And so again, I'm not sure how you would end up recording patients when you're engaging in remote dispensing, but please do not unless you have consent. Video verification is permitted. However, the video must produce a clear still image, and that's so that we can have an audible record of the dispensation. And so just want to flag a couple questions there. I think there were some questions around if you are using video verification, whether or not you would adhere to policy and procedure 21A 421J 67 and 21A 4083, or if you would adhere to the security requirements with the 30-day retention of video. Essentially, this is essentially a record of your dispensation that you are keeping. And so it would be the sections that are cited on this slide that would be applicable. So if you are using video verification, then you would have to store it for the 3 years, not the 30 days, because it's a separate and distinct record than just your video surveillance. The second thing I've just flagged, I think there's a little confusion about what you had to keep in terms of records, whether it was final verification or dispensation records. So you would be keeping a record of the dispensation, but part and parcel of that might be some of the things that you do with respect to final verification. So essentially what we are requiring is just a record that shows the dispensation process, and it's something that we can audit and make sure that the process was done appropriately. So I believe that is the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. And
so we have a few questions. If you have questions, feel free to add them into the chat. We do have a question regarding private space and what's permitted by a private space. It's recommended that before your final inspection, the individual or the establishment should reach out to their inspecting agent. However, Ben had some additional questions if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, let me pull those up. And just so you know, we are taking questions in the chat because I think there's somewhere between 100 to 400 of you folks. And so chat, I think, will just make it a bit easier than the hand raising function. So if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll try our best to answer them. If there's one that we need to follow up on, we'll let you know. And you can work through our email inbox. So let me take a look at the private space questions. Sharon. Okay, so in terms of the private space, as I said before, it needs to be a space where you can ensure that you're meeting the HIPAA requirements and you are protecting protected health information, and that can look very different for different facilities. So I think, as Diana said, we encourage you to reach out to your inspecting agent. There's not necessarily a one size fits all. I think the example that we gave, obviously, a separate room would likely meet those requirements, provided it's like walled off and it doesn't have, like, I don't know, secret passages or something where you can hear things through. But generally, like, yes, CVS does something a little bit differently in terms of their private space. And I think it will just depend on the way that your facility is structured. Primarily, where the goal here is to make sure that the patient can discuss confidential information with the pharmacist, and it won't be heard by the public. In terms of an SOP where the patient is escorted to the back of the house. I think, again, that's something to submit to your inspecting agent, but generally speaking, we would prefer not to have patients go back into restricted areas. Um, so, you know, open to creative solutions to extend greater access to patients. And so, again, it's kind of hard for me to answer on this particular forum what would work and what wouldn't, but we're certainly willing to work with you to find a solution to make sure that there is a space that works for both the patient and the facility and doesn't prevent consultations from happening.
Thanks. We have another question about ratios in the dispensary. Is the 1-to-3 ratio per dispensary location?
So it's not location specific, because you have to sort of think about that there's going to be there's going to be people doing remote pharmacy as well as having people in a specific location. So location gets a little bit gray and fungible at this point. Essentially, it's a 1-to-3. So the way that you should think of this is one pharmacist to 3 techs. And however you set that up is a business decision, but you should have one pharmacist supervising 3 techs, whether it's remotely or in person, but you shouldn't exceed that ratio.
Okay,
Other
does that
questions?
anybody any other questions?
Can you elaborate more on the pharmacist hours? I can elaborate, but I think I'd like to know what the specific question is. So 8 hours must be in person, and then the 20 hours can be telehealth, but they do need to be in person. And I think what you also should know about that is that essentially, if you are a business that has multiple licenses, you need, per each licensed location, you need to be able to meet that. So if you have 2 different licensed locations, you need to have a pharmacist at each for 8 hours and 20 hours for telehealth.
Okay, there's a question on CE credits. Is the required 5 cannabis CE credits required for 2025?
2025. So essentially, I believe you should. The short answer to that is no. Um, but you should endeavor to do it for 2026, given the fact that we are 3 months in, and it's likely that a lot of you won't have remote pharmacy up and running by the end of the year. You should endeavor to do 2020. You should endeavor to do it for 2026. We likely won't collect them in 2025, and it'll be a low enforcement priority. I'm just kind of going.
If you are going to audit the dispensation process and not final verification, then you will not need a recording of a pharmacist going through their steps. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. comment
Yeah,
or?
that's a long question. I did just want to go back really quick about, and then I'll get to this second longer question, about the pharmacist ratio, and the one location to try to maybe sort of simplify it for you. Again, so basically what it is it's remote or in person or a combo. So basically it's 1 to 3, and it's whether it's remote or in person or a combo. So what that means is that you could be in person and you could be supervising two remote tech, you could be supervising three people in person. Or you could essentially be in person and you could be supervising one tech at a different location while supervising two techs at your in-person location. Or you could be um, entirely remote and supervising three techs at three different locations remotely. So there are different combos that you can do. But it's really, I think the way to remember that is that it is per pharmacist. So it's three techs per pharmacist. And depending on whether or not you're remote or in person, or you're in person and supervising someone at another store, which is a common practice at CVS, those are all going to count. And so you just need to sort of remember the number. And then, but there's so many questions. Let me get back to the longer one. Or Diana, if there's one that looks like is being repeatedly asked, I can try to address that in the interest of time.
I think you responded to the ratio one a few times. Um, Still having questions about the 20 remote hours and 8 hours. So just to clarify, there has to be a total of 8 hours on site. It doesn't necessarily have to be by the same pharmacist at the location, but you need at least a pharmacist on site for at least 8 hours at the dispensing location. Um, so I guess the question, the larger one about the process for dispensing and the final verification, if you could address that one.
Okay. I'm gonna look at this one. It's very long. um, Any pharmacy, all that is ordered is the final verification or the prescription that is signed off on by the pharmacist. So essentially, I think that there's some confusion between, and I'll try to explain this a little bit better, but essentially, the question that we had initially received related to the term final verification or remote dispensing. And I think in our initial guidance, we had said final verification, and that was confusing to folks. And so we essentially talked more about it in just the general terms of dispensation to make it a little bit more clear. But essentially, what you need for us to audit is something that shows that you've done the verification process, and done the dispensing as well, similar to what you would provide generally if you were doing the whole thing kind of in person. And the rub here, I think, is that when you're doing remote pharmacy, you are essentially going to be sending documents off to somebody else to take a look at those documents. And so you need to retain what's sent off. You should retain the communications that are made between you. There should be a full, the best I can say, because I think we're getting a little caught up in the terminology, is there should be a full audible record of what you have done, so that when we go in, if there's a pharmaceutical error, we can pull that record and review it to see where the error was, if there was actually an error. So essentially, it just needs to be the full record. I think that's a better way to explain it, but feel free to shoot a question to the cannabis inbox if you need more clarity on that, because I think there's a little bit of hang up in the terminology, and there may be an even better way to explain it after we think about it for a bit, but it does seem to be causing some confusion.
Okay, there's a question. Can one pharmacist oversee more than one location for the 20 remote hours at the same time, provided the 1-to-3 ratio is kept? And just so you know, we have about 5 minutes left. If we don't get to your question, feel free to email it to dcp.cannabis@ct.gov.
So the answer to that question is yes, as long as you can meet the requirements that you need to meet, meaning that you have a pharmacist that's reasonably available, readily available, obviously within reason, but readily available to provide telehealth consultations, and you're able to engage in the remote dispensing in an efficient and accurate way. So really, how you staff it is up to you. But generally, you just need to ensure that you can meet the requirements in the way that you do it. Are telephone consultations acceptable? No. Oh, wait. For what, I guess, is the question. So I'm assuming this is for telehealth. Telephone consultations are acceptable. They would be, I believe that the federal government has said that they're HIPAA compliant. You should, you can go to the HHS website and take a look. We also have, I think we have it in our guidance as well about telephone consultations. If you're talking about telehealth, if you're talking about remote dispensing, then you would need to do a little bit more to create that record and do the verification. So I'm not exactly sure which one you're talking about, but I'm assuming it's the telehealth consultation with patient, and that would be acceptable by phone.
One question that came up, what happens if a location does not have any techs?
So again, that's sort of a business decision of what you want to do, but if you're going to engage in remote dispensing, you're going to have a tech in order to meet the definition of dispense. Essentially, you can register techs with us, or alternatively, you can choose to have a pharmacist that's on site doing the dispensation. But if you do want to engage in remote dispensing based on the way that the law is written, you would need to have techs.
Okay,
Any
there's a
other?
question. Do all pharmacists need to work a minimum of 20 hours? Does that mean there cannot be per diem pharmacists who only work occasionally?
There needs to be, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but it's more about I think if you think of it more about the facility, so the facility needs to have a single pharmacist that works 20 hours per week and and that's for the telehealth consultations.
Okay, we have about 1 minute left, so we'll answer one more question. If your question was not answered, or if you still have questions, please email dcp.cannabis@ct.gov. So that document should just be a picture of the label and products and the initials as the pharmacist on the prescription for the final verification, I presume.
Can you say that one more time, Diana?
Sure. It's from RP. So that document should just be a picture of the label and product with the pharmacist's initials on that prescription. I presume they're referring to the final verifications.
Yeah, I think for at least the one thing that has come to light is the record retention and what needs to be kept. And so I think rather than specifically answer that, potentially we'll either update the guidance to make sure that we are accurately providing a response that's more detailed, or alternatively, if this person could email dcp.cannabis, that would be great, because I think there's some very specific questions. It also does seem like there's a little bit of confusion about what record keeping needs to take place, and I think we might just need to be very granular in what the exact record should look like, and update the guidance accordingly. So that would be my suggestion, is that either he or she sends an email, or alternatively we'll likely update the guidance to address it.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're at time. So if you could just send any additional questions to dcp.cannabis@ct.gov, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Thanks, Lila.